In this training module, I'm going to show you how to finish drafting your patent specification. This includes drafting the detailed description of your drawings and the invention. By the end of this training module, you should be able to finalize the detailed description of your own provisional patent application. Let's get started. Before we look at the provisional patent application template, I want to show you the very first patent application that was ever granted in the United States. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons, maybe because I'm a patent attorney, but this is interesting because this was granted in 1790. You'll notice that it was signed by George Washington, if you can read that signature down there. The patent number is actually X000001. Now, this number was given later because they actually restarted the patent numbering system many years after this, but went back and they gave all of these X numbers to early patents that were issued prior to the renumbering system being restarted. This is the entire patent application. This is it. So when you think about reading a 30, 40-page, 50-page specification with 15 drawings or 30 drawings, whatever it is, that's one thing, and that's kind of how we do it today when we get to the non-provisional patent application stage. In the past, when the patent system was first started in the United States, this is all that an inventor had to submit in order to hopefully qualify for a patent. And of course, the president signed the patents at that point in time. This is issued to Samuel Hopkins of the city of Philadelphia, state of Pennsylvania. He discovered and invented an apparatus for making potash and pearl ash. That's what he made. And he described it in just enough detail, apparently, to be able to show that he invented something new and to get an issued patent on it back in July of 1790. We're going to do a little bit more work than this on your patent specification, but I just wanted to show you this. I think it's kind of cool to see that you can access these types of things online. You can find all of the old patents on the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office website. You can access those either by number or by keyword search, and we've already talked about how to search that. But if you ever want, you can use those as kind of templates or examples as to what you would do. I'm going to show you what I would do in my applications. I'm going to show you an actual application like I've been doing for the tool storage system. And you can see what I've put together for what I would consider a simple mechanical invention. And you can replicate that as much as you want. I'll walk through my process, show you that, but I'm going to leave a lot of the reading to you. You can go through in more detail as much as you want the words that I wrote down. We're not going to walk through word by word my specification, but I'll walk you through the outline of it so you get an idea as to how I approach my inventions and patent applications. So let's turn over now to the provisional patent application template. And here I've got quite a bit of instruction on the detailed description section. It's actually not new though. We've talked about a lot of this stuff. We've talked about the 3 requirements for a written description that is definite. We've talked about enabling somebody skilled in the technology to be able to make and use your invention. And we've talked about providing a written description of the best mode that you as the inventor have contemplated for your invention. We've talked about all those things. We've also talked about different ways to describe your invention, different ways to describe embodiments or variations of your invention. We've talked about the fact that we used boilerplate to cover some of the general aspects of a patent application. What we're going to dig into now is some of that boilerplate and some of the sample or template language that I've created to describe both systems and methods. Now, you might have an invention that falls outside of systems and methods. You might have a new chemical compound or a composition of matter. That would be different. I would recommend that we pull up some of the sample search results that you found that describe those things, and you can mimic or replicate those types of descriptions from those patent applications and issued patents. Most of the inventors that I run into, though, don't do those. They also don't do the genetics type of stuff. I would probably, frankly, I would hire somebody to do that if it was genetics, pharmaceuticals, or chemical, because I don't know much about those fields. But a lot of inventors aren't in those fields if they're not with a big company. So you probably are not going to run into that a whole lot. If you do, though, we'll find another way to help you get some resources to maneuver through what you need to get through. So just let me know. So I want to go through this provisional patent application template a little bit, and then look at the sample that I've provided for you for the tool storage system, and then let you loose to go and do that on your own. I'll also introduce you to a tool that I've created. I don't love it because I think it's really mechanical and it's pretty clunky in the way that it works. It's an Excel spreadsheet. But I know for some engineering-minded people, it might be helpful to kind of see systematically how I would structure a paragraph on an invention in the detailed description. If that's helpful to you, great. If not, you can bypass it or ignore it. It's not a problem. I just wanted to put it out there as potentially one other learning tool for you in case that helps you with the way that you learn. Also, you can see the references here to some of the other tools and resources. I think you're going to want to go back and refer to your innovation disclosure form. I'll show you in my example where I've taken some of the actual text from my innovation disclosure form and I've copied that directly or almost directly over into my detailed description. You can look at mine. We can pull up some others. The description generator, I already mentioned, it's the Excel spreadsheet that you may or may not want to reference in what you're doing. I'll give you a glossary of terms you can refer to. It really is just a glossary of some of the words that we use as patent attorneys, some of the words the patent office uses. You can reference that. We're not going to go through that here in the video, but it's just a normal glossary in case you run into a word that you don't recognize or that you're not sure if it has a special meaning in the patent field. You can look for it there. If it's not in the glossary, chances are it doesn't have a special meaning and it's just means what you think it means. Also, we talked about the patent profanity words or the guidelines that I referenced in another training module. Refer back to that and try to keep that in mind when you're writing your detailed description so you don't create limitations unintentionally that limit the scope of your patent application. So the following example from the template shows some boilerplate up here. It just talks about the fact that we're going to put in a lot of different examples of the invention. We're going to put some details in, but the details shouldn't be taken as limiting to a particular version or embodiment of the invention. It could be combined. The features, advantages, and things of different embodiments could be found in other embodiments, even if they're not mentioned specifically in those descriptions. We've also got a sample system description. This is where I walk through a sample of what I would do with both the structure and the layout for a system or apparatus type of description. And just as a reminder, I use the word system, meaning the overall combination of a bunch of different physical devices working together somehow. Now, they might work together physically, they might work together electronically, whatever it is. They're just disparate or separate systems that work together in some fashion. The individual components or pieces or physical devices within that system, I would call those an apparatus. And then the individual subcomponents, I might call a component, I might call it a module, just depending. It's not critical what word you use there. In some instances, I might even call it those subcomponents an apparatus too. Just be consistent in what you do so it's not confusing to you or to a patent examiner in the future who's reading your patent specification. You'll be fine as long as you have consistent language. So you can walk through this sample. You can see where I've got some brackets here for some more explanatory notes. This is pretty self-explanatory, I believe, but we'll walk through my sample tool storage system provisional application just so you can see that too. Following the system example, we've got a sample method description. This method description just walks through what I would normally do, kind of stepping through the process of explaining what the method would be, either a method for making something or a method for using something perhaps. So then you'll see that you can end your specification there. As long as you cover the written description to show somebody how to make and use your invention with enough clarity that they understand it and without too much ambiguity as to what it means, you'll be just fine. So let's not get too concerned about the exact language, the exact formatting, the paragraphs, the spacing, any of that. That doesn't matter at this point in time with the provisional patent application. The only thing that matters is you meet that one requirement to provide a specification that has a written description that's clear, that enables somebody else skilled in the same technology to make and use your invention, and to some extent shows the best mode that you've contemplated for making or using your invention. Now, one more thing before we get into the sample detailed description for my patent application. I just want to walk through a couple steps that I would recommend keeping in mind as you draft your detailed description of your invention. This is going to follow to some degree the same type of framework that we used when we created the drawings, starting on a higher overview level of the system as a whole, and then breaking down the description into each of the components and subcomponents that make up the system, and then talking about the different functions or the interconnected nature of those components, talking about what advantages perhaps might come from the way that they operate or the way they connect or the materials they're made of. Whatever advantage it is that your invention creates, mentioning that in some of the different versions and descriptions of your invention. So we'll talk about the system level first. We'll talk about an overview of what parts make up the system, how the system functions overall, and maybe what advantages it has. Then we'll go on to list different components and interconnections within the system, kind of the physical aspects or the physical and electrical aspects, the communication aspects if it's a software or electronic type of device. Then we'll talk about the different individual functions of the components, the potential advantages of the components. And then we start getting into alternatives, and I kind of work my way backwards here where I go, what are some alternatives for the different components? What are the alternative finishes or alternative materials or alternative structures or alternative geometries, whatever it might be that makes up your invention. Then I step back out to the system level and I start talking about alternatives at the system level if there are any. Then I would use the rest of the description as much as you want to put in variations of your invention, which we of course call embodiments. Just put in embodiments. In one embodiment, it might have these things. In another embodiment, it might have these things. In another embodiment, it might have these things. And it might sound really repetitive to just write paragraph after paragraph about the different variations. That's fine. If it's boring to you, don't do it. You can skip that part of it. But the more embodiments that you can provide, the more fallback positions you'll have when you run into snags during the examination stage. So I would list the ones that come to mind. I would give a little bit of thought to the critical features of your invention or the critical structures of your invention and think about one or two or maybe three ways that you could put alternatives in there to broaden the scope of your potential protection. But beyond that, I wouldn't list 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 different versions unless they're important to you. You should know that as you list more versions, if you try to claim those versions, the more different they are from one another, the more likely it is a patent examiner will tell you that they are actually different inventions themselves and have to be filed in different applications, paying different fees, getting examined separately. So try to create variations or embodiments that fall within the overall scope of your invention, but are different ways that a competitor might try to implement a competing product without implementing the exact product that you make. So let's go now to the sample patent specification that I've drafted and look at how that's structured for the tool storage system. Now I'm not going to pull up the drawings again, you've seen those, but you'll see as we go through the description that there's a general flow here where we talk about the boilerplate. We kind of give a general introduction of the system as a whole or of one embodiment of the system. And then we step through the drawings one by one. Remember, I mentioned before regarding the brief description of the drawings that I often will take that, copy it directly down into my detailed description. I simply space out the paragraphs a little bit and then fill in the blanks with the additional details. So you'll see that I've got a version here where I show it as I've copied the brief description down, and then I've got a second version where I've filled in the brief description with more details. Once you get through all of the drawings, you might want to put some additional embodiments, alternatives at the end, maybe wrap it up with some additional description about the system as a whole and the advantages it has, and then we'll finish the detailed description at that point. So let's walk through this briefly. I'll try to point out some paragraphs in my sample, but I'm going to also give this to you so you can look through it in more detail on your own time. On this page, again, the blue text is the text from the template. I haven't changed it, and where I have changed it, I've changed the text to be black. Also, if you see green text here, you'll see that that came from my innovation disclosure form. I just copied it straight over, or if I changed some of the language, again, I made that changed language black font. So this is just the boilerplate introduction. In this paragraph here, I introduced the system generally. I talk about different embodiments that I'm introducing, and then I actually just copied in the innovation disclosure form description that I provided in my IDF. This serves as a summary introduction that I think is good because it really gives somebody reading this the perspective of how I came about inventing my invention. My innovation disclosure form is probably going to list out what I thought was important initially in my innovation process, because that's when I captured the details I had at that point in my invention process. So this will walk somebody through essentially a little bit of my process to get to the point where I'm at now. Scrolling down, this is where I'm showing you basically an intermediate stage of my drafting process. You can see I've simply taken and copied and pasted my brief description of my drawings down here. And that's what I do. Later on, I'll take that and I'll space those paragraphs apart, and you'll see that I just start each paragraph or each set of paragraphs for a particular figure with that same brief description introduction. That's for figure 1A, figure 1B. It's possible I'll alter the language a little bit, but usually I don't, because I've written it in a way where it's just a simple one-line introduction and serves perfectly to introduce the next figure. Now note here, you don't have to put together any type of literary masterpiece. This is a functional specification. Functional in the sense that it has to meet a functional purpose of describing your invention. It does not have to flow. It doesn't have to have three-part structure. It doesn't have to have introductions and conclusions and arguments and transitionary phrases. None of that applies here. This is not a novel. This is not your masterpiece work of art. You can do it that way if you want. It won't buy you anything in the patent process. It might actually hurt you because people would not know quite how to read it, and I think it will interfere with just the basic, straightforward description of your invention. So you'll see that I just put a paragraph or two or three, whatever it takes, to feel like I've put in the information I currently have about that figure, and I conclude it by simply moving on to the next figure in the drawings. So we're stepping through one drawing at a time. I've pretty much only got one paragraph for each drawing. This is a relatively simple invention, so I'm not creating a lot of variations of the invention. I've got a couple that I put in their own drawings, and so I don't need to put multiple paragraphs together under one drawing because those variations have their own drawings already. In some cases, I'll actually lump drawings together, put the description for multiple drawings all into one paragraph. If it makes sense, if it's easier to write that way, go ahead and do that. There's no problem with it. You might find that it's easier in some instances, instead of trying to break out and repeat the same information for 3 different drawings in 3 different paragraphs. Just put it into one if that makes more sense and is still clear in the way that you're describing your invention. In figure 5A, we move on to the method. Again, you'll notice this is the template language from the brief description of the drawings. I've just copied it again down here to introduce this figure. For figure 8, I've actually got 2 concepts that I kind of mashed together into one drawing. It was both the gasket and it was a version of the hinge. And I put those into one because it was simply easier. It was a variation on a couple other main components. At that point, I didn't feel like I needed to have separate drawings because I'm just trying to get a little bit more breadth of coverage, and so I put those together. Here, I wrote one paragraph about one of those. I wrote a second paragraph about the other one, and that's it. And I just simply followed that same structure. Figure 9, because figure 9 was the photograph that I took of the actual prototype that I made and installed in my shed, and I already put that into my innovation disclosure form. I simply introduced that photograph using the brief description and a little bit more language, and then copied in the language from my innovation disclosure form. I felt like that was pretty good. Now, I wrote my innovation disclosure form knowing ahead of time that I was going to take that information and put it into the patent application. You maybe didn't know you were going to do that, or didn't plan on it, or didn't write it in a way that transitions very well. I would still look back at your innovation disclosure form, and I would pull all that information. I would make sure that whatever you thought was important at that time makes its way into your detailed description in some form or fashion. That way you know you're covering all the stuff from your innovation disclosure form in your detailed description. You'll see down here at the end of my detailed description that I haven't put in any type of conclusory statements. I haven't put in an ending to my detailed description. I simply just let it end right here. I don't need to wrap it up with anything. I don't need to transition it. It simply is the last part of the description that I'm providing for my detailed description. And if I've provided everything I want to above, I've explained all of the components, the structures, the functions, the interconnections, the operability of it, then I don't need to add more just to make it wrap up nicely like an argumentative essay or something like that. You can, in my opinion, forget some of that stuff that you learned. At least you don't need to try to apply it in patent applications unless you really want to. If that's your thing, go ahead and do it. It probably won't hurt you. It probably won't help either, but if you're just generic in how you write a conclusion to the paragraphs, that's going to be just fine. Okay, I want to show you this patent description generator. Again, I think this is a really rudimentary way to convey the message of how I might describe certain paragraphs in an invention disclosure. But it might work for you to get a little bit better understanding of how systematically you can approach the description. There are a couple instructions. You just fill in the yellow cells. You have to put an indefinite article, a or an, in front of the words that you use. Then copy the text from the green cell down here to go ahead and make your sentence. So I'll show you how this works. So here we have a certain structure and a certain function for that structure. So the specific word that you might use is a controller. And you don't need to copy these words. These are just generic words I've got. The specific word that you call it, this structure, is a controller. Well, what's a more generic word you might use? Oh, it's a component, perhaps. A controller is just a specific version of a component. What are some other words over here in the examples column that you might call that? It might be a module, it might be a block, it might be something else. So we're just taking one word and making it more generic and giving other examples of it. So again, specific word that you would use, maybe take it from your innovation disclosure form, find a more generic word for that same thing or a more generic version of that same thing, and then list examples of the generic version of that thing. This is how we're going to get a couple variations for you of the different words that you might use to describe your invention. And this will give you some flexibility and breadth if you decide to file a non-provisional patent application and it gets examined by a very picky examiner in the future. Now we go down here and we look at what is the function that's performed by this device, by this controller. We've been very unoriginal here in our example, but this controller structure controls a controlled device. I know that's not very interesting the way we've described it, but this is just how it's set up. So then this paragraph here simply takes all of these and puts them together in a typical structure. We say the illustrated embodiment includes a controller from our structure over here to control a controlled device. That's the function that it does. Other embodiments can include a different type of component, the generic word for our controller, to control a controlled device. Again, the function that we've got listed. In one example, the component is a module. Here from another more specific version of a component. In another example, the component is a block. Now, if you took this and you listed this out, we could come up with another example, perhaps for the tool storage device. Here I've updated the form for the hinge portion of my device in my tool storage system. So I've listed a hinge as the structure, and the function of that hinge is to connect the panel to the brace in a way that allows the panel to be positioned vertically or horizontally. A more generic word or phrase that might be used rather than a hinge is a flexible connector. And then different instances or different examples of a flexible connector could include a joint, an articulating interconnection, or a movable coupling point. And what I did here is I just used a thesaurus online and then Googled a few things because I couldn't come up with anything else that was a flexible connector. It's kind of a generic term, which is why it's there. So I used a thesaurus to get a couple ideas. I Googled a few things, came up with just a couple other phrases. These aren't awesome, but they're workable and they give me a little bit of breadth in my language that might be useful when I get into the patent examination stage for my patent application. So what you can see here now is that in this description generator box below, it's created a new description for me based on the language I put in here. Now, once you do this once, you can see that it's probably a lot faster to just write out using your own language in a Word document exactly what you're thinking. But this is here simply to give you an example of the different structure that I would use typically to describe variations of a particular component or device. So here we have the illustrated embodiment includes a hinge to connect the panel to the brace in a way that allows the panel to be positioned vertically or horizontally. Those, of course, come from the structure and function boxes over here. Other embodiments can include a different type of flexible connector from our generic box to connect the panel to the brace in a way that allows the panel to be positioned vertically or horizontally. In one example, the flexible connector is a joint, up here in the more specific examples. In another example, the flexible connector is an articulating interconnection. In another example, the flexible connector is a movable coupling point. So we've just gone and combined the words here that we put into these boxes into a paragraph, into a very structured paragraph that allows you to easily put together the paragraph without having to think further about what you want to write, other than putting the words in that you've already come up with. So I hope that's helpful, at least from a systematic point of view, to see how you can structure paragraphs and sentences in a very systematic way. Again, you don't need to be a literary genius or a novel author in order to write your patent application. Just come up with a way for you to list off the things that you want in your application, find a way to describe them a little bit more generically, and then find a way to list some of the alternatives to that generic version in your application. So that takes us back to all the embodiments. We're just coming up with different words to describe different variations of the same things that we put into our innovation disclosure form. And that's it. Once you come up with a description for the different drawings that you put together and that you already organized in your drawings, that you already described in your brief description of the drawings, and now you've just filled out some of the details. So you should be able to write a thorough and adequate specification to describe the details of the various embodiments of your invention. I want you to go ahead and do that now before moving to the next module. It should take you a little while to get through this. That's understandable. If you spend an hour or perhaps 2.5 hours, depending on the complexity of your invention, I think that's going to be sufficient for you. I don't want you to stress over how well written your description is. What I do want you to concentrate on is following this systematic approach to describing the general system, describing the components, describing the functions, and then getting into the different variations or embodiments that you could implement or that a competitor can implement to make your invention essentially without copying the primary embodiment that you came up with. So go ahead and do that now before moving on to the next module.